Well, good afternoon. We want to welcome you guys to the final and the fifth installment of the Kentucky Valley Educational Cooperative Virtual Micro-Credential Summit. This has been a very successful summit from our standpoint in giving folks an opportunity to discuss and to share and to learn from one another about micro-credentials. As we've said in all of our past, we welcome new members to our sessions, and we welcome those who have been with us since July, as we've had these, or June, as we've had these conversations around micro-credentials and competency-based learning. So as we're moving into a culture of digital learning for educators and students, we have states across the nation that are implementing plans on how to best develop virtual and blended models. And this creates an extremely talented teacher workforce who's going to provide authentic learning experiences for our students, that they're going to have the skills that they can take to their next levels of colleges and career. We do have a great panel with us today, and we're going to go ahead and get started with him today. And I'll just have to say, and I'm going to steal a line from George Gerbil, which I saw in a Johnny Carson show, that sometimes life feels like a black tuxedo and you're a pair of brown shoes. I mean, we have a fantastic expert panel today, and I can't wait to get started and to hear from them and to talk about them. First off, we're going to be having Odelia Young, who's the Director of Micro-Credentials at Digital Promise, and she's going to be serving as our official moderator today. We have Todd Davis, who's the Division Director in the Office of Education Licensure Effectiveness with the Kentucky Department of Education. Alex Dreher, Instructional Design Lead, a Research Scholar with the Friday Institute for Education Innovation at North Carolina State University. Brandy Bixler, our Digital Learning Specialist with the National Education Association. Lisa Thompson, Partnership Director of Asset with the Impact Lab at Radford University. Melissa Tooley, Director of Pre-K-12 Educator Quality and Educator Policy Program with New America. Sandra Hurst, the Director of Office of Educator Effectiveness with the Arkansas Department of Education. Sue Beers, the Executive Director, Members Impacting Instruction Improving Curriculum, located in Iowa. Matt DeLevy, the Executive Director of the Asset Program at Impact Lab at the Radford University. And Alyssa Moore, the Lead Office of Digital Learning at the Delaware Department of Education. And I'm so excited to get this started and hear from you and to learn from you. One thing, you know people are important to you. As you have conversations with them, you bring back something you've learned that you didn't know. And just having conversations with you guys over the past couple of weeks and even yesterday, I've learned something from each of you. So you've already made an impact on my life. So thank you for that. And I can't wait for this to continue. And with that said, and so we can get the panel conversations going, I'm going to turn this over to Odelia Young. So Odelia, you have the call.
Thanks, Robert. I'm really excited to be moderating this panel today. I have the pleasure of getting to work with so many of these people who are helping us answer really tough questions about micro-credentials, but people who are who are really hopeful and innovative about what micro-credentials can do as well. So really hoping to hear the ways in which people have been really successful and what questions still need to be answered so we can continue supporting people in this way. So the first question that I want to start with, and I'm going to have Brandy open us up, is a pretty general question, but I think it's going to take us in a lot of exciting directions, which is, how are micro-credentials fitting into and supporting systems of professional learning?
Hi, Odelia. So with the NEA, we're really pushing the union-led professional learning. And so it's really providing an opportunity for us to partner with districts and state departments of ed to figure out how we can fit into this system that already exists. It's giving us a lot of access points. Some of the big pieces that we always have conversations about are what type of currency can we offer our educators who participate. So every state and every local has different policies, and so we kind of help them, support them to come up with how they can use our micro-credentials to support that type of the system that's already in place. And then one of the new things that we're really pushing, and we've always pushed it, but we've really started to develop it and flesh it out, or we're doing some national and state-led facilitated PLCs. so that we're bringing groups of teachers in, we're training facilitators, and they're working virtually together on a micro-credential. And that we're on our second cycle of that, and it's going really well.
And Brandy, this is Sandra Hirsch from Arkansas, and I just want to add to that, we are actually looking at those micro-credentials, and we're using our AEA here to work on the one, vetting some of those so that we can put them in as our recognized professional development.
Yay.
Look at that cross collaboration already. And Alyssa, I know you all have been looking at micro-credentials widely, but also very specifically on early literacy. Would you like to share about how micro-credentials are fitting into systems in Delaware?
Absolutely. So in Delaware, we're looking at them in several different ways. We're using them, of course, in our tried and true normal way that we've provided multiple professional learning opportunities for educators where they earn, as Brandy was saying, the currency for us is clock hours. So they can earn relicensure hours when they participate in a micro-credential. Our districts and charter schools look at them and sometimes suggest, or during their observation conferences or evaluation conferences, have conversations with teachers around specific topics that might apply to those teachers. Several of our administrators are starting to look at it. When they do evaluations, they often have teachers that are excelling in their craft and always say, well, how can I push further? And so a lot of them have been looking at micro-credentials as a way to help teachers who are already masters at their craft push a little bit further. And the specificity in being able to make things so tailored to the individual really helps them in that realm. In terms of early literacy, we have a Delaware early literacy plan that speaks to creating different pathways for learning. And we are developing, working with Digital Promise and Odelia, a micro-credential pathway in particular, where we'll have 29 micro-credentials across 7 stacks that will eventually lead to an endorsement. And so we have that work currently underway where we're developing those on our own, and we'll be piloting our first several stacks this fall.
Yeah, very exciting. And Sue, I'd love to pull you in on this question because I know you all have been developing micro-credentials and working specifically with schools and also surveying teachers as well to hear their feedback on micro-credentials. So how does this look for you all in your work?
We're a nonprofit organization of about 120 school districts. And we started using micro-credentials or developing micro-credentials as a way to help reach our rural schools, to connect people. But most importantly, what we were seeing is that we had a lot of avenues for people to get learning opportunities about things, but not so many opportunities for people to demonstrate their skill using that knowledge. So we really wanted to bridge that knowing doing gap. We wanted to be able to help teachers prove a skill that they had. And it kind of goes back to my years as a driver's ed teacher. Kids who could really answer all the questions and knew all the rules of driving and could do a great paper about what it is to be a safe driver, but oh my, get them behind the wheel of a car and they can't do it. And I think that was the gap we were trying to bridge with them. And it was an article by Robert that actually got us down this course. So thanks, Robert, for that. And we're seeing less of a need for the currency piece, although we provide licensure renewal credit for teachers. But what we're hearing back from our teachers, it's that pride in learning and knowing and doing, and then they are doing them in groups. So having that collaboration around them has been really important.
Okay, I would not be surprised if many people come to these conversations because of Robert and Jennifer and the amazing work that KVEC's been doing and being leaders in this space. And Todd, I wanted to also get your voice into this conversation about how micro-credentials are fitting in and supporting professional learning in your work.
Funny you mentioned KVEC a minute ago, is that I look at them as one of our leaders here in the state of Kentucky. The Department of Ed has very limited work around micro-credentials. Because we're a local control state when it comes to professional learning, each individual certified teacher has to have at least 24 hours of professional learning each year as part of their contract. And so districts decide on what that looks like, approves that. And the one thing it has to do is it has to align with our professional learning standards, which is basically the Learning Forward standards for professional learning, as well as their continuous improvement plan. So they've got some guidelines that they follow, but they are the final decision makers. That being said, because of some of the work that KVAC has done and some of our other regional cooperatives, they are starting to explore the benefit and the make better outcome or produce better outcomes for their teachers, that micro-credentials are able to provide a better learning experience and get them get them to make a better impact on their students. Additionally, Kentucky has also implemented, we've had a continuing education option for a rank change for our tier pay. And previously that was limited through a state process, but now we've opened that up within the last year. And the cooperatives may participate in this rank change process. And so it's a professional learning process, action research. And so micro-credentials fit perfectly into this. The one thing that it cannot be is just simply just falling back on micro-credentials. They have to, it can be part of their plan, but not all of the plan. And so they have to develop a plan and present it to the Department of Ed and EPSB before we can approve that. But they can use the micro-credentials in that process. One additional thing that we are discussing right now, and I'm anxious to hear a lot of information today, hopefully, and if not, make some connections that we can discuss, is, and I've heard it mentioned already, is renewal and reissuance. Is we've got very limited access to being able to renew teacher certification right now because of our regulations. And then, as far as reissuance as well. And so it's very limited on simply just getting 6 hours of graduate credit right now. And so we're exploring what that might look like. And so in the future, and so anxious to hear some of that information.
Yeah, and Todd, that's an excellent point about like what that looks like. And I want to come back to some of your policy change questions a little bit later, but would love to hear from Melissa about how are micro-credentials being used to meet requirements for personal growth plans and teacher pathways to relicensure.
Great, thanks, Odelia. So we had spotlighted in a 2018 report we put out, Rethinking Relicensure, that Tennessee was one of the first states to sort of think about where micro-credentials could fit into this idea of license renewal and earning specific professional development points or credits toward their license renewal. And so that's a policy that several other states has since adopted, including Massachusetts, Wisconsin. I'm sure there are others. I know Delaware, you just talked about some of your efforts that are sort of bubbling up. I think now is really a time where lots of states are thinking about various different ways to incorporate micro-credentials into their systems. I think that there are challenges in sort of thinking about how to do that. And I don't know if we want to explore that now or later, but I'm happy to talk more about sort of thinking through right now we have systems that are sort of designed a certain way that are mostly a compliance-oriented system for relicensure, for example, where you sort of do something and just by checking the box of doing it, you get the credit and you move on. And micro-credentials, their whole sort of reason for being is that they are about demonstrating a competency, not just about checking a box, that you really have to show something, you have to provide evidence and artifacts that show that you can do something. And so I think one question that is out there, at least for me, is whether putting something that is trying to move towards competency-based into a compliance-focused box is going to sort of have the long-term impact that we want in sort of thinking about professional learning systems and sort of professional learning mindsets and helping teachers sort of think about their career as like one long professional learning journey as opposed to something they have to do in order to comply with a specific policy. But I'll let others jump in on the conversation. We can come back to that later.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. You brought up a lot of really great points. I'd love to give a chance for a couple people to respond with some examples from their state, starting with Lisa, if you'd like to.
So we worked with several states and we've seen several different models. We've worked with West Virginia, who used some of our elementary micro-credentials for relicensure for elementary school teachers. In completing 2 stacks, they would receive a full cycle of renewal. So we've seen that happen at a statewide level. In some districts, we've had the leadership in a local area, much like Todd was talking about, where the superintendent said, you know, these are important core micro-credentials. We want our teachers to be obtaining this information, but we also want our leadership to do the same, because, you know, the modeling of that demonstrates to them the importance of. So this particular superintendent we had a great enrollment from their teachers, but she also had their leadership, their principals, and their leadership team enroll in at least 5, so they could experience that as well, model that for their teachers, and have conversations where they understood what they were actually working on together. And then we had some districts in North Carolina who identified that our classroom management micro-credentials were pretty critical for our new teachers who were just coming out of university and didn't have any experience in the classroom. And so what a great opportunity to provide them with some resources and tools before going into the classroom by using classroom management with their new teacher academies. So they implemented those classroom management micro-credentials to help provide resources for those new teachers before they went into the classroom environment.
And Lisa, this is Robert, and I think that's so important, as you said, for new teachers, but teachers coming out of alternative programs, giving them those skills or classroom management as well. So I think that's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, and Sandra, would love to hear some more about how that looks in Arkansas.
Okay, thanks, Adelia. We sort of had a twofold purpose in this. We thought we started looking at how we could elevate the profession through micro-credentials, and then even how could we help districts understand ways or help them develop ways to increase pay in their expertise. So we went back and revisited something called our old career continuum and decided to add endorsements to it. So kind of like the nursing profession has done over the years, you know, you go from a candy striper to a nurse practitioner, you know, and we didn't feel like we had anything in Arkansas other than classroom to administrator. So going back and looking at from your early career to a career professional, and then to something called a master endorsement or a designation, we call that, and then also to a lead designation. And the difference in those two is a master is more being an expert in your content, where you could do things like be a role model, help do some professional development. But with a lead, we're looking at lead teachers who can lead other adults, almost like in smaller learning communities. So we work a lot with public impact on opportunity culture schools. So we came up with stacks of micro-credentials that can help teachers get there and do that. And we wanted it, we brought in a group of teachers, a teacher advisory group, and they actually built this model. And I think it's interesting, some of the things they came up with that I probably wouldn't have, being out of the classroom and out of the principal role for so long. But they thought of, one of the things they said is our salary schedules are like, we get paid for a master's, but the teacher across the hall is getting paid for a master's, and the master's is not even in the content that they're teaching. So we're working with districts now using this idea of using micro-credentials and that endorsement to increase pay, so that it's not necessarily a master's that you have to have, but you can get the master's. And when you get it in theory, that's great, but then a micro-credential to back that up to prove that you also have the pedagogy behind it. So that's sort of where we are, and we feel like that, well, and let me say just one quick thing here. We actually have some pilot districts right now that are changing their salary schedule just to meet this. So they are customizing it so that in their districts, they want to keep the teachers they have, and rather than them going to another district that's nearby, they feel like that if they give this incentive and this incentive pay that goes with it, they can keep them there and retain them.
That's really interesting, Sandra. Thank you for sharing all of that. And Sue, I saw that you put a comment in the chat about striving to have true competency-based demonstration. Love to hear more about that comment, as well as what does that teacher growth plan look like in the work that you're doing?
We're seeing a lot of our districts that are using micro-credentials use them as tools for their PLCs to take a problem of practice and then actually implement something, a task that is truly authentic and is directly related to the problem of practice. So it truly becomes just in time, need-based kinds of professional development rather than whatever the flavor of the month, the year, the decade, whatever is around professional development. And in working in those collaborative groups, they can share the resources that are provided in the micro-credential for their learning piece, but we really strive a lot to make sure that the tasks that are there really reflect a deep understanding through action, that they are really using evidence to show that they have the skill and can implement the skill, not just know about the skill. So that is, we've often also, when we've done conferences, they can get some part, because we can offer licensure renewal credit in Iowa. We're the only entity in the state of Iowa right now, I believe. I think maybe our local, our Iowa NEA is also working towards that end. But right now, we're the only ones that can provide licensure renewal credit for micro-credentials in the state of Iowa. So if they want to go for a licensure renewal credit, they can go to the conference to get the knowing part and then perform 1 or 2 micro-credentials in order to prove implementation of that skill. And that is really key for us. And I liked what someone said, and I'm sorry I forgot who, about they don't stand alone. Micro-credentials are not your new professional development model. We still have to look at the work of Joyce and Showers and all the 5 components of effective professional development. And we need to look at Daniel Pink's work on motivation. The fact that it has to be authentic work, and it has to be work that I see as relevant to what I do, and it has to have that kind of mastery component to it. And we need to also look at adult learning theory and how we're bringing what we know about how adults learn and what causes them to learn better. We need to bring all these to bear on a system of professional development. We have a kind of a saying, we don't want to do professional development, because you hear people say we're doing professional development. That's a thing. We want to help people develop as professionals. That's an action. And that's our role, and what we're trying to convince districts to do with micro-credentials is to look at the big picture of all of that, put together a true professional development system that is research-based and has all those components, and that really helps our teachers start to feel like the professionals that they are, in charge of their learning, doing their learning, and proving their learning, and feeling good about the learning that they've done. So that's kind of our whole thing that we are trying to do with our micro-credentials as a whole.
Sue, this is Robert, and that's a great point to say that this is part of a system and not a standalone. And I know Todd mentioned that earlier as well when looking at the CE process. This is part of that system. We do have a question from Casey Wills to you. So what was the approval process to be the only MC provider in your state toward renewal, that is?
Sure. We went to the Department of Education, and we still are an hours-based, contact hours-based kind of system for licensure renewal credit. 15 hours of contact equals 1 licensure renewal credit. And so we had to take our micro-credentials and make a case for how many hours it might take someone to complete the task that is at the heart of the micro-credential. Not the learning pieces around it, not the investigation, not the conversations they had around it, but the actual task itself. And so we try to have tasks that are just to do the task, to assemble the evidence. is a 3 to 5 hour thing. We try to make the grain size so that it's a 3 to 5 hour thing. So in order to get a licensure renewal credit, you may have to do 3 micro-credentials successfully in order to kind of wrap those up into kind of a personalized stack to be able to get a licensure renewal credit. So we had to justify the time element of it. I would say we underestimated the time element. People are probably putting in a whole lot more than 15 hours just on the task across to get one. And then, you know, we basically had to develop all the documentation that go with that. We had to put together what the state wants us to call course outlines, you would call stacks, and how those would work together and justify those in order to offer it for licensure renewal credit. And we can offer licensure renewal credit for both administrators and teachers.
And Sue, this is Jennifer. We have another question that kind of goes along with that. It's asking, have your districts connected the professional educators evaluation process, the evaluative process, to the outcomes seen from those who take micro-credentials to promote and connect the system?
Okay, I'm struggling a little bit with what we're trying to ask here.
And I think it's, have we looked at the impact of micro-credentials on teacher evaluation to promote micro-credentialing?
We tie all of our micro-credentials to the Iowa teaching standards so that we can start to monitor those as well. We have a significant number of principals who use micro-credentials with teachers in need of improvement plans, so that it's not this one-size-fits-all PD, but if they walk into a classroom and they see that this teacher is not doing a very good job with wait time, they can work on a micro-credential around that skill. And they, you know, what it provides for principals and superintendents, because we have some very small districts where superintendents are both, it provides them with those resources. It provides them with the reflection questions. It provides them with the success criteria so that they can have really deep conversations with teachers around improving their practice. Same thing with our instructional coaches. So we try to keep it away from just the evaluation, that it's part of an evaluation system. We don't want it to be that leg of the whole piece. We want it to be truly that whole, I'm learning about this, this is a need I have, and we're moving forward with it, and I'm getting better at it.
Yeah, and I just want to add that in a couple of the other summits that we've talked about the work that KVEC has done around research and looking at the impact of micro-credentials versus traditional professional learning. And we looked at it in 3 areas, and that was the impact on professional practice. And in our state, we use the Kentucky Framework for Teaching, which was adopted from the Charlotte Danielson Framework. And then we also looked at the impact on student outcomes, and we used the measure of the MAP assessment, and we looked at the impact on teachers' perception of professional learning using Learning Forward Standards Assessment Inventory. And we saw significant differences between the teachers who engaged in micro-credentialing and those who engaged in traditional professional learning in terms of the student outcomes on the MAP assessment and educator perception on the Learning Forward Standard Assessment Inventory. But we have a problem that I think is pervasive across all states, and that's that principals tend to rate their teachers high on those frameworks for evaluation. They're not really true reflections of professional practice. And so that's an area of further study that we identified in our research that we want to dig a little bit deeper, because we know that the value of the micro-credential is that it has to improve teacher professional practice at the same time it's improving student outcomes. So we've got to get that measure, and it's got to be accurate. So we're sort of doing the same kind of things that you are. We know that it's improving practice because that is obvious, and we know it's improving teachers' desire to engage in professional learning, because as they complete one, they're jumping right into another. But we've got to have that data. So we're with you on that one.
And Jennifer, like spot on, you know, and already teed me up for my next question, which is, you know, Sue talked about it a little bit, just like different frameworks and research that are being pulled into micro-credentials. But would love to hear from Alex from the Friday Institute about what research do you have that best demonstrates the quality or best practices of micro-credentials?
Sure. Thank you, Odelia. So I think there's the design of the micro-credentials, which I think we've talked about before, and the idea of them being research-based, obviously inherently competency-based, job embedded. But I think, and peer supported to the extent they can be. I think one of the things that we saw, so in our courses, we're to give a quick 30,000-foot view of our work, we are an arm of the College of Ed here at NC State, and we do a lot of research and outreach and work with our state organizations, et cetera. But we do a lot of trying things out with micro-credentials. That's really what we do. We try different, whether it's a different platform, whether it's a different style of doing it, whether it's a different type of organizational structure within the context of the infrastructure of micro-credentials. We're going to try those things out. And one of the things that where we came to this was we had a set of online learning experiences in this case, and some blended, that we weren't feeling like we were adequately able to know whether somebody got out of it or was able to demonstrate what we wanted to demonstrate as a result of doing it. So we thought that, this was a while back, that micro-credentials were a pretty good fit. And so one of our online courses, our Learning Differences course, which helps educators understand how students learn differently around areas like motivation, executive function, working memory. And so we developed micro-credentials that were associated with each of those competencies, or those constructs, I'm sorry. And so we ran through, we created we took that course, and we had two versions of it, in quotes. We had a treatment and a control. The treatment was that the demonstration at the end of each of those units was earning a micro-credential, or I shouldn't say earning, I should say attempting a micro-credential. So they didn't even have to earn it successfully, just to attempt it. And then the other was more traditional, like quiz type of assessment that you would have in a traditional course. And we found that those who attempted the micro-credential, there were a few things. Those who attempted it performed better than those who just did the quiz on an independent assessment. And that those who attempted it, they found a level of value in it such that they took it to the end. They resubmitted it and actually wanted to earn it, to a point where every single person who attempted it and didn't earn it on the first shot kept going and resubmitted. So they found value in that coaching process, that Joyce and Showers, that were the coaching, getting it to actual practice, right? And so I think that to me was the idea that again, there was no extra, all they had to do to earn a certificate in the course to get their CEUs in North Carolina was to attempt it. But they each, to a person, each was like, you know what, I see some value in this, I want to reattempt it. And through all of our micro-credentials as a whole, the thousands of submissions we've gotten, we have over 50% resubmission rate, just because, again, it's a common theme. People, once they see some value in it, I mean, again, I don't want to overstate it insofar as you could have 4 components of a micro-credential, and if you get 3 of them and you don't get one, it's kind of, you might want to be like, I want to go the whole way, right? You want to do the 4th. But as a whole, I do think as a whole, people really do, once they sink their teeth into it, they say, oh, you know what? Yeah, it's a little bit more than checking an attendance box, but you know what? I'm actually getting something. I can demonstrate and show what I actually know. And there's something to be said for that. So I think that research to us was pretty revealing when we went through it for our Learning Differences course.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for sharing that, Alex.
Sure.
And afterwards, we'll be sharing some resources, so maybe some of that could be shared as well. Matt, I know you've been doing some research as well. Would love for you to share what that's looked like.
Absolutely. Thanks, Adelia. And thank you to Robert and Jennifer and KVEC for putting this on. What a great venue. And they are truly thought leaders in this space. My name is Matt Dunleavy. I'm the principal investigator on the asset grant. We're funded through the U.S. Department of Education, and we're in our 3rd year. And we developed online self-paced micro-credentials. And echoing some of what Alex said, as well as others, I think the instructional design piece is absolutely critical. So what we decided to do was align all of our instructional design of the micro-credential itself, aligned with the learning sciences, specifically Clark and Mayer's work on e-learning and the science of instruction. But then we also embedded research-based practices within our micro-credentials themselves. And so all of our micro-credentials are based upon the Institute of Education Sciences What Works Clearinghouse practice guides. So for those of you who are familiar with that, it takes quite rigorous research to be in those practice guides, and we thought that was an outstanding place for us to start. So using those 2 principles of not only what we're embedding, but how we're actually delivering it online and self-paced, the results are as follows. We've had 4,500 teachers enrolled across 13 states at this stage. We've collected qualitative and quantitative data from about 1,500 teachers at this stage. And we use something called the Net Promoter Score for the qualitative piece, meaning we ask them, would you recommend this micro-credential to a colleague? And our current rating is 8.5 out of 10. We also ask them, is this going to impact your practice? And 95% of them say it is going to impact their practice. Then we went one step further. We started to run t-tests to look at some quantitative data, and we found significant differences pre-post. And then we just finished a randomized controlled trial with 650 teachers. And the preliminary results on that are, we are seeing significant differences between, with a pretty strong effect size between treatment and control groups. And so all of that to us is still preliminary, but it's also very, very promising for the approach we've had. And I will say, I want to just quickly respond to something that Melissa said, which I think is absolutely critical. We need to keep innovating in this space. And so we have to ground ourselves in research-based practice, make sure we're holding ourselves to a very, very high bar. But we also need to make sure that we are giving ourselves the flexibility and freedom to truly innovate in this space, because there are systemic changes with our education system that are not being solved with our current processes. And I come out of teacher preparation, so I'm not disparaging teacher prep in any way. It's where I spent the vast majority of my career. However, our current system's not addressing the critical teacher shortages. It's not addressing systemic racism. It's not addressing some powerful problems that we have in our system. And I think micro-credentials, and again, echoing Sue and others, is not a panacea. It's not a silver bullet. It's just a tool within the larger toolkit. But I do see it as being one of the more innovative spaces for us to really play and experiment and, yes, fail, but then learn and continue to build. Because if we do not continue to innovate, we will fall into the compliance trap and we'll just recreate the same systemic problems we're all facing.
Yeah, Matt, thank you so much for bringing up the need for innovation and how we support that. I'd love to just open it up to anybody else on the panel who'd like to add to some of those points that he just brought up.
Well, I might add a bit there too. And I noticed in the chat, some people are asking about joists and showers. That is one of the things that we did in Arkansas. We actually used that research to determine, what it really takes to have valuable professional development, because we've realized that over the years, the sit and get's not getting it. We've spent a lot of money doing that out of compliance. And we actually made a policy change in law that we could use micro-credentials to be for professional development and really remove it from the compliance pieces that people call professional learning that really are not. So I think that joists and showers just kind of opened our eyes even to the piece. And I think you were referring a little bit to that, Matt, too. There's some follow-up in there with coaching. It's kind of like, when you look at what they say about research in professional development, coaching is where you get over that 90% of competency. Like if you just walk in and do a sit and get, you walk away pretty much with nothing. And if you follow it all the way through to the coaching piece and the implementation of it, that's where you get the biggest bang for your buck. So I don't know all those numbers right now off the top of my head, but I just know that that's been what's really powerful for us in Arkansas. Enough to make us change our way of doing things.
And Sandra, I think as a state education agency leader, that's such a critical point, because one thing that we need to have innovative professors and teachers and superintendents, but also we need state leaders, superintendents, assistant superintendents on down. And Lisa's already mentioned, we have a strong partnership with the West Virginia Department of Education, and they've been fantastic in terms of their ability to execute on their objectives and their mandates at the state level, but also be relatively innovative in enabling us to have, I think, a fruitful partnership. So I just want to commend the state leaders out there from West Virginia and others who are in this space.
This is Robert. I think that's important too, because one of the things we always stress in micro-credentialing is looking at professional learning differently within the system is that you're not doing this alone. You're creating networks of other educators whether they be teachers, administrators, you're working across districts, you're working across states, to have a great system of professional learning where you can build off each other. So there are no barriers of space. You're all in this together. And that's the great thing about the virtual nature of micro-credentialing, that you can increase that networking.
Yeah, and the role of the state is really interesting, and I'm sure you all have very different ways that you work with the state. Would love to hear more about like how are states envisioning using micro-credentials? What types of policy changes have states initiated or thinking about initiating? I know some states have task force right now to look into this, and that might be around currency or portability or reciprocity. Would love to start with you, Brandy, because I know NEA works with a lot of different states.
All of the states kind of are doing and approaching things differently. But I think like overall, what we really value is that when we are, talking about policies and systems change, we want that educator voice in the room. And so by having our affiliates be part of that conversation, we're bringing forth the voice of our members. And that, that's a really big deal right now. I think a lot of educators have felt like they haven't had their voice, and our micro-credentials are also all created by educators. They're all assessed by educators. So we value that highly in our policy making practices, that, teacher-led professional development rather than the top-down types of professional development. A lot of our policies are around currency and whether or not micro-credentials are being accepted for license renewal, or whether or not they're being accepted for, continuing education or credit hours to move on the salary schedule. Like, they're all different ways. The conversations about the license programs, right? The new teacher license programs, we're very cautious about that because we know that we're in a crisis right now with teachers leaving the profession at 41%. And so we don't really support using micro-credentials as an alternate pathway to teacher licensure, but we do work with universities to make micro-credentials part of their curriculum, part of their coursework, and provide credit for that. So we see that as part of the system, not a replacement for the system.
And Brandy, I want to come back to your thought about micro-credentials as part of these alternative routes, but I want to real quickly hear from Alyssa about how that policy conversation has been developing in Delaware.
So in Delaware, we started with the policy conversation and worked to make sure that we had micro-credentials defined in our professional development or professional learning regulation. And then also made sure that we have, so for Delaware, in our licensing regulation, we have a whole list and chart of different types of learning opportunities that educators can engage in for relicensure. And this is strictly for relicensure, not for the initial license. That's a completely different program. But in our chart of opportunities, we made sure to add micro-credentials there as well. We started out, some of our items in our list have a cap to the number of hours that you can earn in your 5-year period. An educator in Delaware has to earn 90 clock hours in 5 years to renew their license. So we started out, and we currently have in regulation a cap of 30 hours worth of micro-credentials over 5 years. But as we've seen micro-credentials grow, we've started to realize that we probably need to either remove that cap or expand it, because you could hit 30 hours in 2 micro-credentials. But I understand where our licensure and certification group was coming from, not knowing what things were going to look like out of the gate. So that's some work that we need to do now to revise that regulation. But it was very easy. The entire state was on board. Making those changes to regulation and code isn't always easy, but this one took a lot of work, but not a lot of convincing that this was something that needed to happen. Our educators were asking for new and innovative ways to demonstrate mastery of their craft. So that's kind of where we are when it comes to policy, the work we've already done, and the changes that we now have to make as we go.
Yeah, I love hearing that from both your responses, Brandy and Alyssa, just this uplifting around teacher voice and how important it is to like listen to teachers and know that they are, have agency and can bring that forward, and just making sure that we're not doing things to them, but listening to them and helping them grow, especially in these times where there are so many new things being thrown at them and new situations that none of us ever thought that we would be in, and how do we really come alongside as partners for them in this work. So I wanted to go back to what Brandy was, mentioning about just different programs. And I'd love to hear from some people around how can micro-credentials be used as an opportunity to refocus traditional and alternative route teacher education programs in a way that builds bridges between like schools, teachers, and universities. And so I'd love to start with Todd and then hear from a few other people.
So I mentioned earlier our continuing education option, and essentially the plan one that we had and that's been in place for several years mimics national board in that process. And so we opened up that regulation and allowed cooperatives, districts to develop their own process to utilize learning and professional learning model to basically achieve a rank change and not solely rely on a master's that wasn't typically being used in most cases. And so the additional piece is that Kentucky removed that rank 2 requirement, which typically was thought of as a master's. So that played into it as well. And then the micro-credentials, as I mentioned earlier, can be part of that plan. One thing that's interesting is we have had, not necessarily an alternative route, but the regulation also allows, as I mentioned, districts to implement this process and not just cooperatives. However, EPPs can do the same thing, and we've had a couple of different providers that have reached out to us and are looking at doing some type of CEO plan 2 is what we call it. And so they're looking at that along with the micro-credentials and what that might look like. And so it's been really interesting to see and hear those conversations, is that now that requirement for the masters or the rank 2 is gone, those providers are starting to look at things a little bit differently. And so we have had some districts that are looking at it independently. And so some may charge for it and some may use it as a way to recruit and retain teachers as well, as that they can obtain their rank and progress in their pay over the course of time.
Great, thanks for sharing that. And Sandra, I would love to hear what's going on in Arkansas with this question.
Okay, well, in Arkansas, we're probably the only ones that are dealing with a teacher shortage. And maybe I shouldn't even call it a teacher shortage. I think we have teachers out there. I think we have teachers who aren't utilizing their license anymore. So we are bringing in a lot of what we call in Arkansas career changers. These are people who have degrees and they want to teach, but they don't necessarily, want to go back and go through the whole traditional route again. So we've made it possible for them to have many alternative routes, and I'm sure many of you have done that too. But during that journey, we found out that a lot of them are not good test takers anymore. When they were in college, test taking was something they were used to, and now they've been out, in a whole different world, and going back and having to learn how to study for a test was just different. Not that they probably didn't have they have the content, and then we want them to have the pedagogy, but sometimes those tests were a little tricky for them and they're having to take them many times over. So what we did in Arkansas is we actually got it passed that these Act 1240 teachers and also these career changers, and Act 1240 would be those coming into the profession non-traditionally. We did something where they could use micro-credentials as what we call an alternate assessment. So if they're within 2 SEMs of passing the praxis. And we actually worked this out with ETS as well to help us determine what those two standards or two standard areas of measurement would be. Then they can do a stack of micro-credentials in place of. So it just passed. I don't know what's going to happen, but I do know that it's going to affect around 400 candidates who have been trying to pass that praxis. And a lot of these, again, are people who, you know, they might be single parents. They have lots of things to juggle when they get home after school, and going back to school or going back to study is just really difficult. So to me, I'm going to go back to some things people were talking about earlier about this being action research. It really is. And so if you give micro-credentials to someone, to me, it's just a way for them to prove their competency, you know, of what you're doing in real time. You know, it's very relevant to what they're doing. And sometimes we look at the praxis and it just seems like we've heard people over and over say, that's not even what I'm teaching, but I have to memorize it. And then I'm going back and to take this test and pass. And so, you know, and it's not all of the tests that they take. It's a few that have been kind of difficult for them, but we're just trying to make it more relevant. And I guess we'll see what happens, but they're excited about this opportunity.
Yeah, Sandra, that's really, you know, exciting to hear, and, you know, would love to hear more when they go through it and how that actually ends up. And, you know, kind of goes back to Matt's point about like just different ways in which to provide opportunity for people to get into the field and serve that with while making sure that we're also still keeping, you know, that rigor and making sure that people are growing and can have a positive impact on our students as well. And I love the piece also about the action research that you mentioned about, like, because I always think of teachers as action researchers, you know, try that thing in my classroom. That went terribly, like going back to the board. And one of the reasons I really love the NEA micro-credentials that Brandy has supported the development on, and I have read all of them, is, yeah, like all 100 and something, is that they really do take teachers through that process when they're going through the skill of like an action research, looking at the research, how am I planning, how am I implementing, how am I reflecting, and that's a really powerful process. Wanted to give anyone a chance to also comment on that before I shift our gears a little bit as we get towards the end.
Adelia, I was going to ask, and Brandy, if I'm not mistaken, those are all teacher created. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. We bring teachers together over a course of 3 days to write a stack of micro-credentials, and the teachers have been identified as experts in that content area. Mm-hmm. And then it goes through NEA's kind of check, and then it goes to Adelia for Adelia's brilliant mind to check over, and yeah.
Yeah, that's the piece that we're really liking about it. So
yeah, me too.
Awesome.
Adelia, just the one other thing I would just add as we're sort of talking and I think chatting in the chat box about what does it actually take to move toward, so we're sort of putting policies in place that move us a little bit maybe toward inserting micro-credentials into systems as opposed to shaping a system differently. And just as we think about that, you know, right now in most states that are, for example, using micro-credentials as an option for teachers to pursue toward renewal of their license, for example, it is an option. It's not the only path. And I would actually be curious to hear from states sort of what they're seeing in terms of teacher uptake there. Our sense, at least in sort of talking to some of the early adopter states of micro-credentials in this way, was that teachers were a little bit nervous about, there's a risk involved, right? Right now, teachers can go to their conference and get their certificate that says they got their continuing education units, and there's sort of no risk involved. They know if they go and they sit there and they pay their money, they get their credits. And with micro-credentials, there's this risk that maybe I try to earn it and I don't, and then what happens? And so I guess I'm first putting that out there, that as long as there is an option to sort of do it like the old, maybe what's considered to be kind of like easy way, versus the new, untested, maybe more rigorous and hard way, that we may see teachers sort of leaning into what's comfortable as opposed to maybe what's feels a little bit risky or scary. and just something for states to think about as they design policies and how they, I mean, there is this sort of push-pull between, you know, wanting it to be an intrinsic motivation and teachers kind of be self-motivated and engaged, but as long as there's this other option, we may not sort of see the return on micro-credentials that we're hoping for if, you know, we only see maybe 20% of teachers making that option, like taking that option and making that choice. So I guess putting it out there both as a question to states in terms of what they've seen in that area and whether there has been the sort of like rush of teachers and whether there's differences in sort of the profile of teachers who are deciding to engage in micro-credentials versus not, and just sort of what we can learn about that as states develop policies.
Yeah, it's a great question, and definitely open it up to people to respond to. And I just want to quickly say before people like panelists respond that I think it also has to do with the environment that you set. Like you could tell people that they could do anything, but if there's no supportive environment around people being able to do something, then you just said that. You didn't actually, you know, like we have to give micro-credentials like the room and the policy support and the structure support in schools to be able to flourish and have their moment as well. So I'll say that and then open it up to other panelists to respond to that question.
We found, as we've been working, we had probably our first largest batch at one time of micro-credentials come in from just 2 of our districts had 800 micro-credentials come in June. And so we had lots of conversations. We have coaches who, a lot of them returned back, but every single person went on to complete their micro-credential, which we were actually very surprised around. They were getting licensure renewal credit if they completed all 3. They got to pick, we had a stack of 6 micro-credentials around remote learning. They had to, as part of their professional development, pick 3 of the 6 to do. So there was choice, but then also compliance involved with it, which seemed to be a really good mix. Because they were able to access the things they needed to do it. But the comments back from teachers have not been about the licensure renewal credit that they valued or whatever. It was truly about the collaboration and the learning together that they did and how this was going to help them in their personal practice. So I think that's the key for us. And what we're really wanting to make sure we get to is that we have them have choice, but we also have them develop the skills that we need to go forward as a whole organization. So it's kind of a nice mix between the 2.
Great. Would anyone else like to chime in, talk about like what they're seeing about profile of particular educators who are particularly gung-ho about micro-credentials? Alex, do you all have like a profile you're seeing in some of your programs?
I was just about to chime in. I think that in general, we have seen that it is the sort of the complete. So we've actually have 2 sorts of profiles. The first is like the person you sort of would expect, like the go-getter who's going to who any professional learning opportunity you put in front of them, they would complete it, right? The completist. They're going to follow through. They're going to do it. But one of the things that we found that I think is different than we would have had we not have had micro-credentials in our learning experiences was that, for example, we have a course on social and emotional learning that covers like the 5 core competencies, the Castle framework, the 5 core competencies. And we found that, and we have micro-credentials associated with each of those, and we found that there are some people who are highly motivated to learn 1 or 2 of those competencies because, say, their district is doing something like zones of regulation, and they find that self-awareness and self-management are the 2 they really, I mean, they could do them all, but they find those are the 2 that they really need to lock into to be able to get the background knowledge and understanding to be able to deliver that effectively to their students. They're really, really motivated to do those. So they won't necessarily be motivated to the whole thing, but they'll be motivated to do those specifically because we're providing them, again, a context to engage in something that, again, that just-in-time area of interest that they're particularly passionate about or need. So those are 2 of the profiles. That second one, as I said, has emerged as we've started to really break them up to support more modular type of learning experiences as opposed to being part of a pretty bigger holistic experience.
Sorry.
I'm going to add something to that too, Alex. We in Arkansas, I've always heard that when you're on the cutting edge, expect to bleed, and we did. We made it compliance when we first started. And Delia may remember some of this when I first met her. We were taking our novice teachers as our, I guess you'd call it our pilot program. And we said, all novice teachers are going to complete these micro-credentials because they need these in their tool belt, you know. And that really wasn't what they needed. They needed time to breathe and figure out what it was they didn't know about teaching. So what I think when we moved away from making it something that teachers had to do or telling teachers which ones they had to do, but letting them have choice, that's where we found our go-getters and the ones who, you know, at first were complaining like, this is too much, this is too hard. When they came back and actually did it on their own, they were like, wow, this just changed everything. Like just everything, you know, I saw what it was that I didn't know. And now I know, and I need to change it, or I need to, you know, do something different or get more professional, you know, development in, you know, in what it is I need to know better. So I thought that was always just really interesting. We just sort of, we found that out like, so I guess going back to the profile of that, I think that, you know, teachers found out that their work was actually getting better or their skill and their craft was improving when they did it, you know, with fidelity and did it because they chose to do it.
Yeah, I think it's really important. I was like, you know, early on when we were doing those pilots at the same time, always saw that the greatest indicator of educators enjoying doing it was that they felt like their voice was heard, that they had a say in the micro-credential they pursued, and had some support around it. So yeah, you know, Sandra, I think those of us who've been working in this space for several years now have, you know, had a lot of very humble moments in which we're like, okay, we need to shift gears in what we're doing. And that's like the great part of about this work is like just listening to the voices that matter the most and making sure that we are continuously just improving the work that we're doing.
We should have another session on like humbling moments. That could be 2 hours. I could go on for 2 hours myself, just in all the whoops, we didn't foresee that happening. And we have a few.
That's why having conversations around developing a new system for developing as professionals, or DP as we call it, is so important. Because if we don't have this kind of upending of the current way we do professional development, and really start to see it as not just a little tweaking of the system, but as a whole new system, as a way of really emboldening educators and giving them that, you know, responsibility and choice, but also holding us responsible. You know, it's not just I want to go explore wherever I want to explore. I also need to make sure that I am doing what I need to do that's right for kids. So that, you know, getting that balance back to some kind of new system is going to be important. But if we continue to just kind of tweak around the edges and we just kind of bring this in and kind of slip it in somewhere, we're never going to get to that kind of upending of professional development that I think we need to truly get to all of the research we know is right at what we need about professional development. So I think it's not just taking a model and just kind of trying to do the old thing in a new way, which is kind of what's occurring sometimes in schools right now with COVID and students.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
We have this opportunity to completely change education for kids in this new world. And instead we keep trying to mold all this new way of learning into the old, you know, base it on the old model. So
yeah,
you know, that's a really big point for me, as you can probably tell.
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, I feel you here on this side in Oakland as well. I think, and that goes back to how we're structuring things, like, but especially the questions that we're asking right now. You know, oftentimes people are like, well, I'm interested in this research question. I'm like, well, is that the right research question? Are we just asking that research question because it's the one we've always asked? And if those are the kind of, you know, questions or things we've been pursuing that have gotten us the system we have now, then we probably should abandon those and think about some other ones as well. But I think that's a great point, Sue, to get to this final question that I would love to hear from everyone on the panel, if you feel comfortable sharing, which are, what are the key areas we need to continue to focus on in using micro-credentials to advance professional practice and student outcomes?
Sue, or Adelia, this is Matt. I wanted to just echo what Sue just said, because it does tie into your question. So I'm not doing the political thing of not answering your question. I really am addressing your question, but I don't think Sue's point can be overstressed. And to a certain extent, I think it's upon us. So, you know, the elephant in the room is the fact that there's massive disruption taking place at the higher education level as we speak. And that's directly relevant to this conversation. So if you look at what's taking place in terms of revenue generation at every single university in this country, who doesn't have the cachet name of an Ivy or a brand, which is the vast majority of higher ed is going to be forced to innovate or they will die. And that is just the reality of it. And that includes teacher preparation programs. And to a certain extent, I think that same environment is upon K-12. Just to date myself slightly, I mean, I got my license in teaching through a PT3 grant 20-something years ago. And it was the exact same problem we're talking about now, meaning there weren't enough qualified teachers going into inner city schools and rural schools. And so, you know, I'm 50 years old. And so this is not a new problem, but what is new is the fact that now we have, to a certain extent, an existential crisis upon us. And I think micro-credentials are one of the tools that we can use, but this is not going anywhere. And I agree that we cannot afford to tinker with the system. We have to have state agencies, local education agencies, individual schools, and teachers willing to say, we're going to test completely new systems and see what works. We have to experiment in this space, because if we do not, we're just going to continue to implode as a K-12 and as a higher education system, because the reality is in front of us now. Not to be a bummer, but I think we have to.
No, Matt, that was great. I thought you did answer my question and continue the conversation. So it was, you know, perfect.
And Matt, I'm just going to say we're fortunate enough here to actually be over educator prep. And what's been interesting is, you know, at first getting everyone to buy in on something new and innovative from our higher ed was just not there. You know, we don't need to change. I don't know why we need to change. And, you know, K-12 saying you need to change. And of course, it was just back and forth, you know. So we're actually working together. We've got some groups coming together to really work on what that looks like in higher ed and how our educator prep programs can use micro-credentials. And they came to us wanting to be the content writers for these 2 SEMs that I spoke about. And I said, that's perfect, because you're the content experts. You should be writing these micro-credentials. But I need someone to teach them how to do that. So I'm gonna reach out to a few people after we're off of this panel today.
One of my soapbox comments I come off with is, as we have opportunities currently to move forward with new types of learning, whether it be virtual, however, often what I hear happening is we're taking new innovations, and how can we put this into the same system? And how can we make that tweak and fit? We don't need to tweak and fit. We need to develop the new systems to make this a part of the system. So that's my soapbox. I'm glad I just had to say that before we heard from others.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and, you know, I'm not going to reiterate everything everyone said, because I think that's all right. I think we all agree that, you know, just trying to like fit a square peg into a round hole is not going to solve the problem here. We need to just fix the whole board and rearrange what that looks like. I will say that I think as we often see, this is just sort of a challenge for us to be aware of as we move forward and thinking about these systems, is that people are always sort of looking for their opportunity within a system. And so right now, like part of, in my personal view, the reason that some of our professional learning systems have been sort of corrupted by the marketplace of professional development provision, and that there is some potential for that to occur with micro-credentials as well. If there isn't some sort of clear bar for what quality is and how we assess that quality and maintain that quality, I do think that micro-credentials have a ton of potential to sort of push teachers in their professional growth and learning and demonstration of learning, and opportunities to get recognized for that learning. I think micro-credentials have a ton of potential, but there's also, again, sort of, as with any sort of new innovative idea, there's always folks who are going to try to twist that to meet their own goals or purposes. And so unless we sort of, as states and districts and policy thinkers, structure things in a way that allow for innovation and movement at the same time, that there's some attempt to have some quality control within that system, I just think that that's something that we haven't figured out yet, but is going to be a critical piece as we work to design the new system and have some sort of like checks and balances on the system.
With that last comment being said, and I don't want to cut anyone off, but we are out of time and we need to move forward. And there's other conversations that we can have. And I know there's a last comment in the chat box about the gold standard. And we do have design principles developed how micro-credentials can be looked for that. But I will say that this has been awesome for me, and I have enjoyed hearing from all of you. And I thank all of our presenters for the awesome information you've given us today. I will say this is the last session of our 5-session summit. However, it is not the last conversation around this. We're going to be moving forward with a digital action podcasting that's going to continue these conversations. Some of you have already agreed to be on this podcast, so we can get into some deeper conversations about what you're working on within your particular states. What I would like for our participants to take away from this is a national phenomenon taken in the United States of looking at changing systems, of how competency-based learning using micro-credentials as one of those tools is helping to change that system. So this is exciting for me to hear in my 36 years of education of how we are taking steps forward with our teaching profession, which teaching is a great profession, and I have always been a great supporter, and I will fight to the death for our education here, or for our profession. So with that being said, I want to thank all of our participants for being with us today. Thank you, panelists. One thing I would say, many folks have asked for research and articles. So panelists, if you wouldn't mind, if you have research and articles that you have done, please send those to me. And as we send the recording out to those who had registered for today's event, they will also receive your work as well. And they may reach out to you as well for more information and conversation, so we can expand the work for competency-based learning. And with that, that concludes our final session. And I hope everyone has a very successful rest of the week and year. Thank you.